Hey, it's Dave from the camera store. Today it's all about convenience. This is the Canon RF 24 to 240 millimeter lens. This is the Canon RF 24 to 240. Now, it doesn't seem to get a lot of press and a lot of people don't talk about it. I want to talk about it because recently I was on a trip to Jasper and it's an amazing place. It's so beautiful there, but me being me, I packed way too much gear. I packed a nice wide angle lens, a nice general purpose lens, and a fantastic telephoto lens to capture everything that I could see. What I found myself looking through my photos after the fact is that majority of my photos from that trip were with the most versatile lens that I had. So that's where a lens like this really comes into play. If you're not really sure what you're going to be shooting or what you're going to be working with, this lens sort of covers everything. Now, there's a lot of compromises with this lens, and I'm not just talking about the price. First, let's talk about the focal length of this lens. I mean, it's a 24 to 240. That is a huge range. It's a 10 times zoom. Now, we don't often get that in a lot of lenses, and there's a reason for that, which I'll talk about a little bit later. What I like about a lens like this, though, is, for instance, we're down at Bowness Park, your beautiful park here in Northwest Calgary, and it's got some paddle boats and stuff, and it allows me to stand on the shore and get some nice shots of the boathouse and the rental house, but also zoom in on a lot of different details and stuff that I couldn't do with another lens that I'd have to swap it out for something else. It effectively has majority of the focal lengths we're going to use most of the time. 24 millimeters is a nice wide angle, great for shooting nice vistas, landscapes, things like that. Of course, it has 35 millimeter on there, which is my particular favorite focal length. And we can go up to 50 mil for portraits, 85, 100 mil, great for head and shoulders, that kind of stuff. We can also zoom in and get some half decent wildlife shots at 240. So the convenience factor of a lens like this, it really pays off. Now, that's the good part. The downside is, because of a lens like this, we have a relatively slow aperture. So it's an f4 to 6.3. So it's only f4 at the very beginning, and it quickly goes down to f6.3. So it certainly means our light gathering ability is compromised. The nice thing, though, is that there's ways around that. We can use a tripod when we need to. Now, it does have stabilization, but we can also address things like depth of field, which is a bigger factor for that. If I was shooting exclusively portraits, I can certainly get some nice shots with this, but I want to manipulate my environment to really get that nice shallow depth of field. That means putting my subject far ahead of the background, things like that to get the best look. But it's very versatile in its focal range, and that's the selling point of this lens. Now let's get into the design and the build quality next. All right, so this lens doesn't sport the red ring or that nice sort of off color of white. We have to sort of go with the black with the silver banding on the front here. However, the lens does feel like it's put together quite nicely. We do have this giant ring at the very front of the lens here, and this is what our zoom mechanism is controlled by. And that's where you're gonna spend a lot of time grabbing it, and that's great because it is very smooth. Lens certainly does extend outwards, but that's the nature of this style of lens. It's not internal zooming. This lens is not weather sealed, so keep that in mind if you're out shooting in sort of inclement weather. Now, behind the focus ring, we do have this nice knurled ring, which is much smaller. Now, the nice thing about this is that this is what's going to control function, whether we want to use it as our exposure compensation or our aperture ring or focusing. And now here's where it's kind of interesting. If you look at other Canon RF zoom lenses, they have 3 rings. This one only has 2 rings, so there's a switch here from focus or control. So I can either use it for focusing or in control. Now, the interesting thing is, I can't just switch to focus and use it as a manual focus. I have to enable that manual focus in the camera itself. Now, I suspect that most people buying this lens here aren't going to do a whole lot of manual focusing, so it's not a huge deal, but just be aware when you're using that. Now, of course, we do have the stabilization on or off, and this lens gives you about 5 stops of image stabilization. That's really nice to have that, especially when it comes to those longer telephoto lengths and more suspect shutter speeds, which you're likely going to be using more of when you're shooting with the apertures that this lens has. And the final thing that I'll talk about on this lens is, because of this zoom barrel design like this, they sometimes get prone to what's called lens creep, where the lens will just sort of seep out on its own as you're carrying it. So at the 24 millimeter position, there is a lock switch right beside the shutter button here that I can easily lock or unlock when I'm using the lens as I'm walking around with it. Now, when it comes to the aperture, it's a 7-bladed aperture, and it does produce some nice sun stars, but you have to stop it way down to like f22. Now, the other thing we have is a nano USM focusing motor. And I like that because these cameras nowadays are being used for video as much as they are for stills. Now, what's nice is that in the past, older lenses had a more mechanical motor and they were very noisy, so we didn't use them when we shot video. Nowadays, if I'm shooting with video with this lens, the nano USM is very, very quiet, and I can maintain that autofocus even in video without it getting into the soundtrack whatsoever. Let's talk about the image quality that this lens is capable of producing. Now, there is a lot of engineering going into a lens like this. If you look at the higher end lenses, for instance, the 2470s, 7200s, they're cut up into much smaller segments than this 10-time optical lens. And the reason they do that is the engineers can control the optical properties much better when they cut it up into much smaller segments and get improved image quality. But then you lose that convenience factor of this kind of zoom. So a lens like this has a lot going on for it, but there's a lot of engineering going in to make this happen, both optically and in the software. Now, what I'm finding when it comes to the image quality of this lens at 24 millimeters, the center sharpness is quite good, and it keeps quite good all the way up to about 100 millimeters. But if you go to the full range of 240, there certainly is a drop off of the sharpness. It's still very acceptable, still really quite good. And stopping the lens down only improves things marginally. So it's already a f4 to 6.3 lens. It's fairly dark to start with, but I'm finding the image quality is pretty decent. Now, there are some chromatic aberrations which are corrected for in the software. You can do quite easily, and you can also have a little bit of vignetting as well. It's most prominent at 24, like a typical wide angle will be, but once again, that is corrected for in software. And that's where this lens is really interesting, because typically a 10-time optical lens is very difficult to engineer and design. So there are flaws within the lens, they just can't factor out optically. But now, with the software embedded in the camera, you can really see what it's capable of doing. What I'm finding is that Canon has done a very good job of designing this 10-time optical lens, but all the imperfections that you can't engineer out of optically, they've corrected for through software. And it produces some very good results through the whole range. So overall, what do I make of this 24 to 240 from Canon? Well, I find myself really enjoying it because the image quality is very good. Yeah, it's not quite as good as the top-end L series lenses, but I wasn't expecting that. For me, the joy in using this lens is how convenient it is. I can take a scene and I can zoom in on something very quickly. I don't have to switch lenses. I can totally see me carrying this on a Peak Design capture clip because it doesn't weigh a ton and I can carry it around quite easily. And I've got something that's incredibly versatile. Imagine hiking. I don't have to take my backpack off to switch lenses. I can just simply zoom in and zoom out on the people I'm with or anything that I see along the way. A family camera for trips, vacations. If you want to go just one body, one lens, you have to deal with some of the shortcomings of this lens. Certainly it's not as bright, as fast as I like it to be, but there's workarounds for that. I can use a tripod a little more often if I need to do those long exposures. I can certainly get a nice shallow depth of field if I manipulate my environment a lot, but I can make this lens produce some very good image quality, and the convenience factor, I can't understate how nice that is to have. Now, I of course want to know what you guys think of this 24 to 240 from Canon. Do you already have it, and what do you think of it if you do? And are you thinking of adding it to your kit? Make sure you leave the comments down below. Follow us both on Instagram, and please subscribe. Hit that notification bell. We'll catch you again next time. Hey, thanks for sticking around and watching this very convenient lens episode. If you want to check out more of our recent content, click up here. And if you are Canadian, you want to support local, check out thecamstore.com down here.